Let's go back to metformin, and let's do it now through the context of an anti-aging drug. So there's going to be some people listening to this who already know everything about you, if for no other reason than the efforts you've put into TAME. Obviously, I want to have plenty of time to talk about that, but let's back up for a moment. Tell me when you first realized, hey, this metformin drug that I worked on 30 years ago, it's not just a great drug for people with diabetes. This could actually be a drug that helps someone without diabetes live longer. What was that epiphany for you?
So first of all, there were studies on the biology of aging in rodents. And the first guy, which I'll be embarrassed now to forget, he's a guy from Leningrad that was the first to say, I've done rodent studies and animals with metformin, Anatoly, I'll remember it maybe later. And he showed that life extension increases in variety of animals to which he gave metformin. That led to some studies.
What was his hypothesis? Do you remember? What drove him to do that?
There was never any clear hypothesis.
This was just a pure fishing expedition?
It even wasn't related to glucose metabolism necessarily. He thought that maybe there's an anti-cancer effect, and he looked at that, but then he got models that were hypertensive and they also lived longer. So he thought those are different effects, and then he considered to aging. But at that time, this was in the 80s when he started that, and it bothers me that I don't remember his name.
That's okay. You'll remember.
I should take more metformin. And he was pushing, he was showing up in meeting and showing. And so people have tried to do it in the United States, and they showed that there is a significant effect on insulin. By the way, the effect of insulin in animals is 10%, not like rapamycin, it's 24%. So there's a milder effects, but in every study, they showed that health span is improved, by 50%. So the effect on longevity was less than the effect of health. By the way, that's perfect for what I'm trying to say. I'm not for longevity, I'm just for health span, right? So if we can live healthy, die, that's fine with me.
Yeah, the so-called squaring of the longevity.
Right, squaring of the longevity. So he started Asimov. His name is Asimov. So that's what Asimov showed. People have started looking at that. There are several studies, 3 studies that gave it also to nematodes. They also lived longer. And there's several effects on health span in the biology of aging. Now, the reason... There's a lot of needle threading here in my story here, okay? But I want to tell you the moment that I knew we have to do this study was a publication, not in a very high impact journal, but it was an amazing study that could be done only in the UK. Because in the UK, you can go into pharmacies and look at prescription that they gave, and you could follow the mortality of those patients.
Because the NHS system allows you to centralize everything from prescription to usage to mortality.
Exactly. And they don't need to be de-identified after mortality. When you're dead, you're not private anymore.
Okay.
So they did this study. So what they've done, there are 4 arms to this study. They came and took patients who are on sulfonylurea, 12,000 patients, okay? And they matched them to 12,000 people without diabetes. Okay, same pharmacies, same doctors, controlling for some other things. And of course, the people on sulfonylurea had higher mortality than their control.
Right, because of course they had a reason to be taking the sulfonylurea. Yeah.
Right, they had diabetes. So that's okay. Then they took 78,000 people on metformin and 78,000 people who were non-diabetic. Again, matching them.
And the 78,000 on metformin was metformin monotherapy.
Monotherapy.
First line.
Right. And they watched their mortality. So just to underline again, the people on metformin had diabetes. Yes. The control didn't have. They were more obese than the control. They also have more diseases than the control. But they had significant less mortality, 17% less mortality in the metformin group. And this, the sulfonylurea group was, okay. So if you get less mortality with metformin when the setup is diabetes, that really shows that metformin has a very important effect in humans as far as aging.
What was the median dose of metformin in those populations?
They were over 1,000 milligrams.
That's it, just 1,000 milligrams.
Well, they intended more, but the average was about 15 milligrams.
Average was 1,500?
Yeah, no, 1,000 milligrams. I'm sorry. This is a discussion there. I don't think they really could validate the dose.
Because an elegant thing to do, if you have 78,000 in your database, is now stratified by dose. Absolutely. Who's taking 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000?
They couldn't do that. And I really cannot answer you if you can get back to the data or not. I really don't know. The dose we chose came from other studies. But, that's not the only thing we know about metformin.
What was the time course of that, by the way? Do you know how many?
5 years. 5 years mortality.
So 5 years exposure to metformin or 5 years of prospective mortality following?
No, it was all a prospective study, okay? It was all a prospective study. When they started, okay, they went back, they looked at everybody on metformin.
Oh, I guess what I'm asking is, do we know how long they needed to be on metformin to achieve the benefit?
No, we don't know.
Okay. So we followed them for 5 years of mortality in a prospective cohort, but they could have been on metformin for 5 years or 25 years. We don't know.
No, it's newly prescribed metformin. They were not more than 5 years.
So we have normalized by duration as well.
Absolutely. No, they haven't been on metformin before. Those are newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes.
So Nir, that's a pretty, to be blunt, goddamn staggering result. So my metformin moment, nowhere near as dramatic as yours, basically came out of a research project I did with two analysts in 2013. And I don't even remember what prompted the question, but there was a question we had internally about what was the benefit of metformin. Oh, no. Now I remember the question. The question was there a relationship between hyperinsulinemia and breast cancer? This was the question we wanted to ask. And as we dug and dug, something kept hitting us over the head over and over and over and over again, which was with or without diabetes, with or without obesity, with or without hyperinsulinemia, any way you sliced and diced the data of people with type 2 diabetes with and without metformin, they got much less breast cancer, which then dug us down a rabbit hole if they seemed to get much less cancer, which was, that was a big aha moment.
Right. And there are hundreds of studies that show the association between metformin and less cancers. And not only that, less all cancer, except prostate, by the way. Prostate is hanging there, maybe a little bit. And when we went, and I'll tell you later, but when we went to the NCI to make them partners in this TAME study, it was really interesting.
Can you tell people what TAME stands for?
TAME stands for taming or targeting aging with metformin. And it's a study that's designed to prove the concept that aging can be targeted, but also, or mainly for me, is for the FDA to give an approval to an indication that's like aging.
The first time I heard about TAME was actually here in this city. I was having dinner with Steve Osted. It must have been in 2015, maybe 14, 15. Steve is a gem of a human being. I consider him certainly one of the most important mentors in my exploration of this field of aging.
We're partners in many ways. He's a great guy. He
is one of these guys that has, his knowledge is out of control. You can't ask him a question that he doesn't know where to go for the answer. I have the highest respect for Steve and can't wait to interview him here as well. But I remember him telling me about this, and my first thought was, Steve, that's a crazy idea. The drug is free. Who the hell is going to pay for this study? NIH can't pay for it because they don't consider aging a disease. Pharma can't pay for it because there's no way to make money on it. I mean, I might pay like 10 cents a year for my supply of metformin. It's a free drug. I said, you're doing the wrong study, man. You got to do this with rapamycin. So talk to me about the challenges of this. You're proposing something that is really never been done before.
Can I just ask you, are we going back to metformin? Because you asked me about diabetes, but not metformin action. Will you ask me later?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay,
I cannot wait to dive into metformin. Yeah, we're not going to get off this topic for a while.
So look, if I'm answering now why metformin and not rapamycin.
Oh, you don't need to answer that question. I was just sort of teasing Steve that day. But
well, there are people who are asking, and of course, metformin, we have preliminary data. We have the cancer. We have clinical studies. Clinical studies of metformin, the diabetes prevention program, it prevents diabetes. The UKPDS, it prevents cardiovascular disease. The Alzheimer literature, there are 2 clinical studies to suggest that in mild cognitive impairment, it improves some domain. By the way, like name recalling. Asimov.
We'll up your dose after dinner.
So there's lots of, and safety. Look, if we're going to have a new indication, we don't want to kill anybody on the road. With rapamycin, we won't be sure. And it causes diabetes, and it causes testicular atrophy and cataracts in animals. Okay, so we have to play it safe. So
I would only add one caveat in defense of rapamycin, which is with constitutive dosing.
Right, and you're aware of the studies from John Manick, right?
Yes, of course.
The last ones.
Yes.
So
So my view on rapamycin is it should not be dosed every day.
Exactly.
It should be selectively dosed to target mTOR complex 1, leave complex 2 alone.
Exactly. And we'll get back to that because I'll tell you what we've done with metformin for the biology of aging part. So that's why look, we are a bunch of professors, including Steve Osted. We go to the FDA. By the way, beautiful movie by Ron Howard. He went with us to the FDA, to the Senate.
Wait, has it been released yet, this documentary?
It's a year and a half ago.
I'm sorry that I missed this.
It's called The Age of Aging. It's National Geographic. It's the best movie that was done ever on aging. It's really quite incredible. Ron Howard is narrating it.
I remember, I'll tell you what, I was having dinner with Steve at some point he was in New York for that being filmed.
Yeah. So we're a bunch of professors that are coming to the FDA and kind of telling them, that aging has biology, but this biology also can be targeted. And they said, so what? We said, well, if you slow aging, then you prevent a bunch of age-related diseases altogether. And I said, well, we're interested to hear. And we went through this discussion with the FDA. I would say that the most interesting part, and you'll appreciate it because you're diabetes-centric. I see you're.
I'm actually not. I'm purely age-centric.
You're metabolic.
But I'm diabetes. I think of diabetes as a great example of what happens when you don't fix things earlier.
So we told them, basically we came and we said, we'll do a study, and what we're going to see is cardiovascular disease and cancer and Alzheimer and mortality and diabetes. And they said, not diabetes. We said, what do you mean not diabetes? They said, no, diabetes, look, you diagnose diabetes. First of all, you diagnose it on a chemical test. You decide.
Yeah.
And only 40% of them 10 years later will get complication. We're really not interested in diabetes.
Wait, did the FDA actually say this?
Absolutely said it. And by the way, I should add that there's another bunch of people who came to tell the FDA that they should allow metformin for pre-diabetes because the DPP said metformin prevents diabetes by 30%. And the FDA said, well, if you think that's important, why don't you make the diagnosis of diabetes in 5.8 hemoglobin A1C? It's not up to us to do that. And they wouldn't give them an indication for pre-diabetes.
That's a very counterintuitive point of view when you consider the long-term, not short-term. The short-term cost burden of diabetes is relatively trivial, but it's that long-term cost burden that becomes quite elaborate.
It's very boring with you because we have the same views. You're right. So we had to adjust our study. We had to take diabetes as one of the outcomes.
Yeah.
and put in and, just increase the number and take diabetes out. It's not that we're not going to follow diabetes, but the FDA is not interested in diabetes. Yeah. So the challenge was, how do we define aging in a clinical study? Because one view is,
because you can't use survival, overall mortality.
Well, there's no biomarkers to aging. All the diseases are their major risk factor is aging, so how do you define it? And we basically did a lot of work and published a lot of work and showed that, okay, let's take somebody who has survived cancer and he's 65 to 80 years old. What's his chances of getting cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, mortality, right? The other things. And let's say it was 10, okay? And okay, now let's switch it around. Let's take somebody who had cardiovascular disease. What's his chance of getting cancer and all the others?
Yes.
10. Okay, let's take somebody with Alzheimer's. What his chances? It really, with aging, it doesn't matter. The disease you get first depends on, your genetics and environment. If you have a mother who's diabetic and you're obese, you'll get diabetes first, okay? But really, because we age biologically, in different way, whatever it is, the next disease, you're going to get the next disease, and we don't know what's the next disease, but that's what we're going to prevent.
That's sort of like, it's a really interesting idea you propose, because it's in lending, you would call that asset value correlation. So you'd say, well, let's say Nir comes to my bank and he has a credit card and he has a car loan and he has a student loan and he has a mortgage and he has a personal business loan. Which one is going to default first? I don't know. I mean, I could sort of tell you, typically people are going to stop paying their credit card before they stop paying their car and their mortgage. But boy, once you default on one, those dominoes start to fall very quickly. And so that would have what we would call a very high asset value correlation of default.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like this is the same for disease.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm saying it a little bit different. I'm saying I'm agnostic to the disease.
To which the first one is, it's just...
I'm agnostic. It doesn't matter what you come and what you're going to have. I'm going to prevent whatever it is. That's why we have a composite. Okay, a composite.
And people get very prickly about composite outcomes.
Very.
And I'm gonna get on my soapbox for a minute here, because this pisses me off to no end when people get all bent out of shape about how you can't have a composite outcome. And this is the bias against aging, really. Because in the end, what matters is how long are you alive and how long is your health span optimized. So I'm sorry I made that rant as short as I normally could. Normally that would be a 10-minute rant.
Well, that would be a 10-minute rant for me too, okay? Yeah, absolutely. And this is where we get into trouble. I'll tell you what the other piece is, but we had our grant reviewed at the NIH, and unfortunately...
And is this inside any of the groups except NIA? Like, is NCI weighing in on this?
Yes, okay. Yes. I'll tell you what we've done. I'll tell you what we've done in a second. Let me just make sure that I say that. So our reviewers were not JRSI, because everybody is involved, and we have 14 centers. Okay, so everybody is involved. So the reviewers are from other place, and they just a minute. You're saying that aging can be targeted and one drug can do it? You're crazy. Okay, there's no such thing. Why don't you do 3 studies? One study is metformin cardiovascular. One study is metformin cancer. One study, and we're saying no. Because what are we doing? We're trying to give aging an indication. Suppose we do...
It's just such anathema to the way they think. And I'm not saying that to be critical of them, right? But they're in a silo.
I know.
Which is, if you come to NCI, how can you care about anything but cancer?
Right. I know. The silos are really killers. But for us, so you could say, well, let's do all those studies. But for us, we're calculating the power.
I was just about to say the power analysis on that study is going to quadruple your budget.
No, well, for what they decide.
Yes, for the silo
but
study.
For us, it's not only the budget. We don't want to stop the study. Let's say that we show in 2 years that we delay cardiovascular disease, it's significant. They'll stop the study. And they said, no, everybody now has to be on metformin. But we wouldn't be able to show the FDA that
if
we
it
are
actually
that we are
changed.
aging.
Yeah.
For us, aging is stop telling us diseases. We are going to have a cluster, and we're just going to delay the aging. So we'll get the health span extended by 2-3 years. That's what we're trying to show you. And the significance is for the cluster, not for the individual disease. And if you tell me to do individual disease, I need triple the budgets, and I'm not going to get to the FDA with the indication for aging.
So it seems to me that the biggest challenge here is not the funding, it's not the study design, it's the conceptual leap. It's a completely different paradigm of how we think about delaying death.
Correct.
Where do you stand today?
So I'll tell you a few things. First of all, we conceived it. I got my friends to what I call a French prison in Spain somewhere. We were in a parador in the middle of nowhere in Spain for several days, saying, what do we have to do in order to open the field for aging to allow us to get to treatments? And we decided several things, but one of them is to go ahead with TAME. By the way, I'm saying French prison because the food was good, but it was in Spain. And I started getting those people, those clinical people together, and we started really thinking through for what it takes. And we had this whole academic and wrote papers in order to say how we're thinking of cluster of diseases, how we're doing power calculations for targets aging and stuff like that. We really spend a lot of time with the best people. Now, our friends came to us and said, just a minute, your study is $70 million. If the National Institute of Aging is going to spend $70 million, that means the National Institute of Aging is very small. It's just 3% of the budget, although we are 80% of the diseases, right? Then we won't have money for the grants. And I said, well, what I'm going to do is two things. First of all, half of the money is going to come from somewhere else. That's my association with AFAR, where Steve and I are the scientific directors. And for AFAR, I got the other half.
So the 35 million is already raised, and that's mostly philanthropic.
Right. And then we went among the institutes. And
so NCI should chip in a bit.
NCI, NHLBI, NIDDK. They didn't commit because first they have to see the review, okay? Or they have to have the decision that the NIA wants. I would tell you, though, that the NCI director, who's a good friend of mine, is waiting for TAME to come. You know, he's like, where's TAME?
So the NCI has committed. It's basically a bunch of contingent commitments.
I just want to say committed is the wrong word because they didn't have a budget yet and the grant didn't come to them. But I know that they will give them money because their head will do it.
Yeah. So that's good to hear. So realistically, when is the soonest you would begin enrolling for TAME?
You know, I'm waiting for something to know next week. And if next week goes well, so I just want to let you know that we have an alternative. The alternative is non-for-profits. That the reason they haven't joined us is that their charter is not to fund anything that the NIH funds. They want something riskier.
Of course.
So if the NIH is not funding because they feel it's risky, those will fund. So we can start anywhere, and it's the answer is early 2019. Okay, we're basically all our centers are ready to go.
How many centers?
14.
How many subjects?
3,000.
Age?
65 to 80.
Any limitation on comorbidities?
No, in fact, well, there are a lot of limitations, but we're very inclusive.
But no existing diagnosis of cancer?
No, unless they're cured.
Okay, so you could be in remission, but you can't have active cancer.
Yes.
You could have secondary prevention or primary.
You could have cardiovascular disease, in the past if you're okay now. You could have mild cognitive impairment, and low speed walk will be a criteria. So, in other words, we don't want the people like in my study who will become centenarians because we're wasting time on them. We want people who we know are kind of in the midst of aging. And we know that it's never too late to target aging, and that's who we're taking.
So 65 years and up, 5 years studied, and you're going to randomize 1-to-1 or 2-to-1?
1-to-1.
And the placebo versus what dose of metformin? 2 grams?
1,500. So So first of all, I should tell you that Merck company from Germany is giving us the placebo and metformin.
Right.
Okay?
So the drug is free.
So when you say nobody's interested, it's true, it's generic, but actually Merck has the worldwide license for metformin, and they're actually giving supply to lots of studies because they kind of realize that this is good. And
do you think there's a difference between generic metformin and branded in terms of efficacy? Is there any reason? No. So they're really, this isn't necessarily accretive to them because one can buy metformin generically anywhere.
They're not going to make more money from giving us this. Well, I should say, even now, a lot of the metformin suppliers have higher sales, and a lot of them are non-diabetic.
Yeah.
So
for sure.
This thing, which is bad for me, because I don't want too many people to know that, right? I want to do this study. I want people.
Well, you'll have, I don't think, hopefully it won't impair your recruiting and the power analysis. I mean, it's funny, honestly, Nir, I would have guessed, but this speaks to the non-linearity and complexity of estimating power. You can't do it without the tables. I would have guessed you needed a bigger N than 1,500 in each group. You are using 80 or 90% power?
90% power. But I should tell you, look, for every disease, we have almost a 30% effect, and we chose 22% effect. Okay, for every disease, we have preliminary data for the same.
Got it. So you lowered your threshold to call it 20% from 30%.
Right.
And at 90% power, you've hopefully powered this.
Right.
You've got buffer both on your power and effect size.
Right. And again, we don't want to stop this study early either for one effect. So we carefully thought about it. We asked for a grant for 6 years because we don't want to overdo it. Okay, so it might finish in 4 or in 6, but we have the flexibility to look at that.
Any non-US centers, or are they all US?
No, we decided to do only in the US because of communication, and because, look, outside of the US, people came and said, we'll fund TAME, but how, if they say after 2 years we won't fund them, it's very different. Because if it's a center, they need to be part of the power, and we cannot afford to lose them. So we, those and other consideration, we decided to stick with the United States.
So let's go back to what we really glossed over, but now I want to dive into. Why do you believe at the cellular mechanistic level, metformin is an anti-aging drug?
So let me take you through that in I don't want to say schematic way, because we don't have the scheme here, but in a way that maybe I think will be easy to think. So I want to start by saying that studies have shown that some of the effects of metformin are through AMP kinase, and some of them are independent of AMP kinase.
Yes.
Okay. Is it important? Not for metformin, but I don't know which are the ones who are relevant more for aging. Okay. And it's hard to know, and it'll get complicated in a second more. So metformin gets into the cell through a transporter that's called OCT1. Okay. This transporter is not equal in every cell. So unlike fenformin that goes without the transporters and affect everything, metformin is peculiar in this way. But we have the preliminary data. And it binds to complex 1 in the mitochondria.
Does it do so preferentially? Does it gain entry preferentially into the liver in humans?
Only in the sense that there's a nice concentration of OCT1 in the liver, but but it's not. I don't think it's the top. Other organs have.
So basically, it's more about OCT distribution and expression, maybe than tissue specificity.
It's more that I want metformin everywhere. Okay, I want metformin everywhere, and I'll tell you how I kind of proved that. So now, metformin binds to complex 1 in the mitochondria. I'll tell you that metformin has some action, epigenetic action, that are independent of the mitochondria. You can do it with what's called row 0 cells. You can deplete mitochondria and see and measure things, and you can measure things even without mitochondria. Okay, again, Do I need the mitochondria?
What type of epigenetic changes do you see in the Rho cell?
In histone deacetylation. Okay? So I cannot argue that this can be important. It's not important if we use metformin, but it's important if you want to ask me, are the mechanism of metformin AMP dependent, mitochondria dependent?
So there's an HDAC property that we may not have even thought of before.
Right.
Okay.
So it gets to the mitochondria, and in the mitochondria, it basically changes ADP, ATP ratio, and that's a lot of it is important in the liver, but not only, to the extent that there is an activation of AMP kinase.
And Nir, is there a demonstrable reduction in NAD to NADH in that cell when complex 1 is inhibited?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Those studies have been done. So there's a lot that's going through AMP kinase. And I would tell you that downstream of AMP kinase, there is mTOR. Okay, and it decreases mTOR activity and increase autophagy, and there's a whole pathway that will go to the pillars of aging.
You know, I asked David Sabatini this question a month ago, and he doesn't know the answer, but I'm hopeful that maybe one of the postdocs in his lab will start to figure this out. I'm very curious about what the dose equivalent is between, in terms of purely looking at the readout of mTOR inhibition, what is the dose-to-dose equivalence of metformin via AMPK versus RAPA directly? And David didn't know the answer, which tells me nobody probably knows the answer.
Right. Look, it's really difficult. First of all, for example, lots of the non-AMP kinase activities are on much higher doses of metformin. Okay?
Well, that's my point, is can you clinically match them? And
No, because you really don't know at the end how much metformin is in the cell. What we're doing now, we're doing isolated cells. In other words, we treated animals with metformin, and we're taking isolated cells to just see the variability of metformin in individual cells.
Even amongst homogeneous tissues?
Yeah. Like we take hepatocytes and look at the
variability of expression.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's all kind of an important question, but the story is still, I'll tell you the story, because at the end, I'm going to answer you what is that doing for aging, okay?
And I don't want to rush this story because this is a great story. You take your sweet time, please.
So think about it in a scheme. You have the metformin in the middle, getting through the plasma membrane, getting to the mitochondria. And on the left side, let's say, there is the AMP kinase, okay? Now, in the right side...
Oh, sorry, just for the listener, explain what AMP kinase does at the high level. It's a hormone of what? It's a hormone of nutrient deprivation, and therefore it tells the body to do what? Like when you don't eat for a day, AMPK goes up. Why?
Well, but it's also an exercise mimetic pathway, right?
Yes.
That's what happens with exercise, really. That was the hope of what AMP kinase is doing. But it's a nutrient sensing that is in part upstream of mTOR.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but the other side of metformin is what happens to the mitochondria, because in a way, and I hope I won't regret saying it here, but metformin is a weak cyanide. Okay? Look, what
thought cyanide acted at complex 4.
Right.
Oh, you just mean more broadly speaking in inhibiting the ETC.
It inhibits. So
yeah,
there's less ROS production, okay? And then there's less inflammation, and there's other things that's going just because the mitochondria is less oxidative pathway going down.
So this is a great example of why binary thinking doesn't do very well in biology, right? It can't be all or none.
Well, so now I can go on and connect all those.
Please do.
To eventually the pillar of aging. But I want to insert another thing, because other things are happening. For example, insulin levels goes down, right?
Why? Is it just due to the reduction of hepatic glucose output?
I'll tell you why I think. And then also inflammatory factors are going down. And there's a whole NF-kappa B action of metformin that might be part of the ROS and part could be independent even without mitochondria. Okay, it's that confusing. But this is the point I want to make. I don't know which one of those is important for aging, but parts of what you're measuring is the following. You fix the aging on a cellular level. Okay, so the cells are younger. A lot of things are correcting themselves. So I think at the end, the lower insulin levels, the low inflammatory, are not necessarily a direct effect. And that's why we're fighting all the time about what metformin is doing, because you can measure lots of things, but the things you're measuring are because aging was fixed. And once aging is fixed, then there's whole hemodynamic readjustment or whatever you want to call it. And then you're measuring that everything. And this is not only typical to metformin. This is with rapamycin, with resveratrol. You also can see that there's a lot of things that are improving themselves. And I think we have to get used to the fact that when you have a drug that we argue what it's doing because everybody is measuring something, some of it is true, but it's like secondary. It's you fixed it. How did you fix
true,
it?
and unrelated. And it's funny you mentioned those three, which again, I think speaks to an advantage you have with TAME. So when you look at rapamycin, resveratrol, and metformin, the big advantage of metformin is you already know the dose and the frequency. With rapamycin, over dinner tonight, I'm going to give you my philosophy on the dose and the frequency, and we can discuss it, but I can't demonstrate it to you with anywhere near the validity that you could do the same with metformin. Had a wonderful discussion with David Sinclair, and bioavailability came up on resveratrol, right? So maybe all the trials that say resveratrol is meaningless are simply not looking at what happens if you get enough resveratrol in the right place. And again, it's amazing to me how many times in biology we can make mistakes of the first order because of a third or fourth order omission. And this, I guess I don't think I realized it until you just gave that explanation, the value of effectively millions of patient years worth of data on metformin, not just from a safety standpoint.
By the way, billions. It's billions.
Is it
years
billions?
Of use. Yeah.
So billions of patient year data on metformin. I know that from an FDA standpoint, the highest priority is safety. That's a low bar to cross. The more interesting one from the standpoint of this study is actual efficacy.
Right.
And it seems like, if I'm hearing you correctly, metformin is an amazing B student. Let's not be insulted by that. What do I mean? Are there better ways to inhibit ROS if you want to hammer the ROS chain? Probably. There's clearly better ways to inhibit mTOR if that's all you want to do. Are there better ways to modulate HDAC? Yes, I'm sure there are. But it might be that maybe part of metformin's beauty is it does so many things at a B+ level. Never it's an A student, but it's not a D student. And it's never, I'm sort of thinking about this sort of in a tongue-in-cheek way, but it seems to do so many things reasonably well.
Well, I call metformin a tool from my perspective. It's just a tool to show that we can target aging, because I think that there'll be much better drugs and combination drugs and other in the future. Human lifespan is 115 years. We argue.
Maximal lifespan.
Yeah, maximal lifespan. We argue because there's somebody 122, but there's a statistic thing. So, okay. We die before the age of 80. So there are 35 years that as a species not that we cannot change more, but just now, without thinking too much futuristic, low-hanging fruit that we can do. And metformin is the perfect tool to start showing the proof of principle here. But the future is much better. It's just you have to pave the